Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This webinar is going to cover DataStax Astra's REST API. We're going to introduce a little bit, look at the docs, and then we're also going to have a demo portion where I'm going to throw together a shopping list app built with React that directly talks to our database in DataStax Astra and show you essentially some nuances of how the REST API works. Yeah, let's get to it. All right, a little about me. I'm an apprentice here at Anant. Joined in about December 2019. My most recent series that I did was doing SQL and reporting on Apache Cassandra with open source tools. With that, we covered technologies like Presto, Spark, a couple notebooks like Jupyter, Polynode, Zeppelin, Quix, and then a couple other open source BI tools like Metabase, Redash, and how you can use those to do SQL and reporting on Apache Cassandra. If you missed those, or if you want to go back and read the blogs or watch the webinars that are attached to them, you can click the links, or you can just go to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/AnantCorp, and you can watch the videos there. So like I mentioned, we're going to take a quick look at the docs and see what you can do with their REST API. I have a repo that I've already made with a little starter template for the shopping list app, and then also a completed version, which is not refactored and not really optimized. So obviously it's not production level code, but it gets what we need to do done. And we're going to be using this with Gitpod, which is an online IDE, which is really cool. There's a link below the last bullet where you can check out what Gitpod is. But essentially, if you click that third bullet, and if you already have your GitHub linked to your if you have your Gitpod authenticated on Gitpod, it'll directly open up the repo in Gitpod. I've already done that to respect everyone's time. And we'll also be using a DataStax Astra Studio notebook to create our tables. We could do that with the API, and I'll talk about that in the docs, but the app is strictly just for CRUD operations. So we're gonna create an item, get items, update an item, and delete items. All right. I already have the docs loaded, so we'll just go ahead and take a look at that. So with the docs, you can talk to the specific database object. So you can interact with tables. So you can CRUD with tables. You can CRUD with columns, and you can CRUD with rows. And so there is authentication where I've already done that for you, or at least the code's there, and all you have to do is put in your credentials into the environment file, and I'll show you that in a second when we get to the demo. But essentially, when you're making your request to the API, you have to send the token, and they have a special header called X Cassandra token, and I'll show you that when we actually get to the code. So with the rows APIs, we can post rows directly, or we can submit queries. I didn't touch this to make queries, but if you're interested, you can go ahead and look at it. And again, it's pretty similar. You can, for the columns, you can also get key spaces, you can get all, and then tables. So they also have the DevOps API, which is pretty cool. And you can create a new database, terminate it, resize it, park it, and unpark it. So depending on what kind of app you're building or what kind of app you're using, you might be able to utilize this DevOps part of the API. All right. And so like I mentioned, if you click this third link, it would open up this Gitpod. And essentially, it looks like VS Code because a lot of the extensions you could use are very similar, but it's based on the Thea engine. And so before I get to this, we're going to go and look at our DataStax Astra account. I didn't bother showing you how you can set it up because if you've been following it or not, we worked a good amount with Astra. So there's plenty of material we have on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/AnantCorp, where you can go back and watch videos on how to get started with Astra, or you can check out DataStax's videos themselves. But essentially my last webinar that I did actually called Cassandra as a Service in the Cloud. We took a look at Astra, AWS key spaces, and Azure Cosmos DB. And I showed you how to get started on all three of those. So you can actually go back and watch that video on our YouTube channel. So if we look at the repo, so if we just follow the instructions, at least to if we jump ahead to 6, just so we can get to the npmi, so we can have that running in the background while we do other things. We're just going to cd into the template, and we're going to mv example.env to the env. Oh, I messed that up. I got to rename that. Sorry. .env. All right, and then if we go back to the README, let's go to the preview. That's what I want. We're going to run npmi, and then once that, whatever, we're going to input our credentials. So if we go into our Astra account, so this is a database already spun up and have been using. So if it's on the free tier, so you get a 10 gig free tier when you use Astra, which is really nice compared to Keyspaces or Cosmos DB. If I hit connect, from the jump, I can get my URL that we'll need for the API. But before we get there, we want to go to our Studio tab, and that's going to open up DataStax Studio. And at this 4th bullet in the slide deck, you can click on this link. And essentially, it's a Google Drive folder. So if I download this, I can drag and drop it into my Astra Studio instance, and boom. So you have this API getting started notebook that I've already created for you. So what this notebook is going to do, it's going to create a table called shopping list with 2 keys, ID and item name. The ID is going to be the primary key, and it's a UUID. Then we're going to insert into there one item that we'll eventually see and then interact with in our app. So if we go into our schema here, let me click on test, which is my key space name. I see that I have no tables. So if I go ahead and run this first one, I should see my shopping list table get populated. And then I'll go ahead and insert a value, and then I'll just make sure that record is there. And it is there. So that's all we need with DataStax Studio. Again, we could potentially do this with the REST API itself, but I just wanted to focus on CRUD item operations with the app. So you can either utilize this, you can utilize the CLSH terminal that Astra provides, any way you want to do it. But I have created this notebook for you if you need it. So I can go ahead and close out of Studio. So if I go back to my Gitpod instance, and if I go to my env that we made, so my username is username, password is password. This API URL is essentially this right here. So we're just going to go ahead and hit copy, and then we're going to paste that in. And then our key space was test, and our table was shopping list. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. I'm going to close this. And we can go ahead and just run npm start. And what that will do is, it's nice where it gives you a browser preview here, but I'll go ahead and just open it in a new tab so we can get a full view of it. Okay. So now if I go into my source folder and I go to app.js, I just have this div hello world. So ideally we should see that. Great. Again, this is the template. I have a completed version here, but it's not refactored and it's not optimized, but it shows you what we can do with it. As I mentioned before in the slides, or when we looked at the docs, I've already given you the code for getting the token. Again, you can set this up however way you want to do it, but if you just want to play around and get started, you can quickly have it. So essentially, we're using our ENVs, so our username passwords, and the authentication, and we're getting back the auth token. And then we're going to be using that in our requests that we make to the API. So for our get, post, put, and delete, we're going to be utilizing that in our header. So if we go back to our source folder, we're going to create a new folder, and we're going to name this components. And in the components, we're going to have 2 files. We're going to have the shopping list file, shoppinglist.js, and then we're also going to have a edit modal.js. And the edit modal, so the edit's a little bit more involved, but it's pretty simple once we get into it. So starting from the shopping list, we're just going to import React from React. And then we're going to do export default class shopping list extends react.component. And then we're just going to do a quick render, or actually, let me do a constructor. We're not going to be passing any props in, but we're just going to have it in case if you want to expand on it, you can. This dot state dot equals, and then we're going to have an items array. And then we're going to have a render, and then a return. And then we're going to have the div. Just as a setup, I'm just going to copy and paste this into the edit modal, so I just don't have to retype it. I can just say edit modal, and then I won't need this because we're not going to be utilizing state in this edit modal. We're going to pass it down through shopping list. Okay, cool. So we're going to need a component did mount, so that way we can render our items in our state, or when the life cycle runs, we're going to run the get items, so that way we have our items populated. So the first function we're going to run with is get items, and we're going to need to make this an async function because we're going to attach an await to the get Astra token function that we set up here. So while we do that, actually, so I'm going to import get Astra token from token.js. So here we're just going to set up a try catch. Again, this is not necessarily optimized for production. This is just something you can get your hands dirty with. So go ahead and make any changes you want to it, fork it, do whatever you want with it. So we're just going to do a fetch, and we're going to look at the docs. We're going to go to get rows. So the docs are a little bit confusing to where if you want to try this on your own, you see how it says retrieve rows. It says get rows based on primary key. If you do that, and you put in your primary key, it's going to give you back only one item. So the way to get back all items is you do not include this primary key part. Instead, you do everything before that. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste this into our fetch with string literals, and then we're going to add in the credentials we have from our process or from our env. So up until API REST, we can replace. So if you look at our env, it goes up to API REST shopping list. So I'm going to do API REST $. It's going to be process.en. Again, like I mentioned, I could have a config file in here, but it would just, that's one more file I have to make. So just, again, to respect everyone's time, I'm just going to do this way, API URL. And then if we look at key space name, we want to replace that with React app key space. And then our table name, we want to replace with the same thing, but instead our table. React app table. So let's make sure fetch processing v API URL, React app key space, React app table. Get rid of this trailing slash. So we're going to say in our method will be a get. Our headers, we're going to need a header called x Cassandra token, and that's what we're going to pull in with the wait get Astra token. And then after that, we're just going to chain dot then response. If response is not okay, JSON. object e else, we're gonna res.json, and then we are going to call data this dot set state. We are going to set items equal to data.rows. So it's essentially going to be a array with nested objects. So we're just going to access them that way. We're just going to add console log error to our catch statement. So that's essentially it. So then we're going to call this in our component did mount. So we're going to do this dot get items. And so to then display that, so we're going to go into our render. We're going to create another div just because React has to have two of the same tags over our game. The first and last tags have to be the same. And we're going to have a form and also this list. So we're going to have 3 div sets. So in this unordered list, we are going to say this dot state dot items dot map item I, so that way we have a key, a unique key for each thing. Say list. Within this list, we are going to give the item dot item name. Nope, need to put this in brackets. The way the casing here comes back from the way we set up our table, but it's not that big of a deal because it does what we need it to do. Add a key here. So key is going to be I. So I'm going to save that, and then I'm going to go back to app.js, and then I'm going to import shopping list from component / shopping list. And then we're going to throw that in and then save. So ideally, when I click this React app, we should have Apple. Great. So our get works. So we know that our token went through, we're getting back a response, and we're able to parse that response and put it into our state. So now we can move on to adding an item. So if I say handle add item, and this is going to have to be another async again, because we're doing await in the headers, it needs to be an async function. So essentially what we can do is we can set up our form. So outside of the list div, we are going to make a new div. Again, like I mentioned, I'm trying to respect everyone's time, so I'm going to be probably missing some HTML stuff. So like HTML4s, some like names, etc. But if I refactor the completed version, it'll be in there. So form, we're going to need a label. So this label is going to be add item. And then we're going to have an input. And then this input is going to be a type text. The ID, because we're going to extract it, is going to be add item. And then we're going to have another input type equals submit. So if I save that and refresh it, we have our item. So if I hit submit, you notice that it triggers a full re-render. So what we're going to do is we're going to attach an E inside of the handle add item async E parameter. So we're just going to do e.prevent default. So that's going to prevent the default action there. So then we're going to say let add item equal document.get element by ID. And we're going to get item, and then we're going to get the value from that. And then we're going to do let rec body equal. So this is where, again, like the API gets a little funky. It took me a little bit of time to figure it out. Maybe I just wasn't seeing anything right away, but when we're doing a post, so this body params, so it's going to be a columns array. So you're passing in a key value that is an array of objects. So when you're looking at it, there's going to be a name, which is correspond with the column name that you're adding. And the value is going to be the value that goes into that column. So like when we're adding an item, we need to add an ID and we need to have a value for that ID. And then we're also at the same time adding a another value to the item name column, and that has a value. And that's what's being put into our form. So we're going to, in this columns array of our request body, we're going to have two separate objects. So we're going to have, just make sure it's columns. Yep, columns. It's going to be an array. And in this array, we're going to have name is going to be ID. So that's our column. Value, I'm going to show you in a second, but so the second object that goes into our columns array of our request body is going to be name, item name. And the value for that is going to be add item. So I've already, because we set it up as a UUID in the table, I've already imported it. So it's in your package JSON. So when you do npm I, it'll automatically get installed. So we're going to do import v4 as UUID v4 from UUID. And then we're just going to plug that in as the value for our ID. So we're just going to call that function UUID v4. And then what we can do here is we can just copy and paste our try catch block that already has the from our get items, and then we can just mess with it. Okay, so our endpoint doesn't change because we're still posting 2 rows. If you scroll up, so you can see we're still posting 2 rows. We just have to change the method to a post. We have to add a content type so we don't get flagged. So application JSON, and then we also need to add a body, which is going to be json.stringify our rec body. And so instead of saying data this.setState, so after our promise resolves, we can just call this.getItems. So that will trigger the re-render and we should see our updated item. So I'll go ahead and save that. And then also another thing is we can add here e.target.reset. And so essentially what that will do is when we fill out the form and it submits, it's going to clear the input. So if we go and we add an item, so we have apples, so let's add pears. Okay, I forgot what I remember what I forgot to do. I forgot to add an on submit into our form that we made in our render. So on submit, this dot handle add item. So let's try this again. So for refresh, if I add pairs, great. So our post is working. So now if we want to move on to delete, so we have our handle add item. So let's do handle delete item. Again, it needs to be async because we're doing this await in the headers object in our fetch request. We can just copy and paste this catch block, try catch block, and just modify it as needed. Okay, so instead, what we'll need to do actually is because the endpoint for delete, like most delete endpoints, you're deleting to a specific ID when you're deleting a single item. So if we go into delete rows, you see this is where that primary key comes in. So like what this is actually set up, so if you include primary key here, it's more like get by ID, and this is like delete by ID. So I guess that's a better way to put it. So if we go in, we're actually going to need to pass in. So let's pass in delete ID into our function. And if we go to the end of our endpoint, we are going to add delete ID. So it knows what ID to delete. We can get rid of this. We don't need a body anymore. And so we can keep it like this. However, the way that the delete response works, this res JSON is not going to work. So we could call this.getItems here instead of res.json. But just to make it faster and a quicker way to do it is we can just say this dot set state items, or this dot state dot items dot filter item item dot ID is not equal to the delete ID. So that's going to return an array where it's going to return all items that do not equal the delete ID. So essentially that's handling deleting without calling a refresh, and is just going to quickly re-render our items. So let's go ahead and add that delete into our render. So we're going to add this to the items themselves. So we're just going to add a line break here. And then we are going to add a button. This is going to be a delete. Oh, I see why. These actually are supposed to go into the list. Oops, okay, so sorry. Let's add the line break here under item name. So it's going to be a button, and this is going to be delete. We're just going to say type equals button on click. We're going to bind it this dot handle delete item. And if we save that, and then we also need to pass in here the item.id. And so when we pass in item.id here, that's going to get plugged in here and again here, and this should be ready to test. So if I refresh, let's go ahead and just add delete test here. So our post worked, and if we delete it, let's see, where did I mess up? Must have messed something up. Oh, that's why. That's the problem with copy and pasting. Forgot to change the method. Okay, apologize for that. So we made the method delete. So this should work now. So if I refresh, delete test, delete, and it worked. Great. If I delete another one, should work. Let's just add apples back. All right, I'll leave that one. It's misspelled, and we'll fix that with the edit functionality. Okay, so now edit's a little bit more involved because we're working with the modal, just to make it a little bit easier for actually testing it. So the first function we're going to have for this is going to be called create edit modal. And this does not need to be an async function because we're only messing with this dot set state. We're going to say is editing. We're going to set it to true. We are going to take text to edit. We are going to pass in the text to edit, and then we also are going to pass in the edit ID from the rendering. All right, so let's go ahead and add those items to state. So is editing, it's originally going to be false. Text to edit is going to be an empty string, and the edit ID is also going to be an empty string. So now we're also going to do the same thing for this. Instead, this function we're going to name close edit modal. And this, we don't need to pass anything through. And we just need to set is editing back to false. Okay, so then let's go ahead and add a button next to our delete. click find this dot create edit modal. Right, and this is going to be called edit. If I save that, now we have our edit. Obviously, it's not going to do anything because we don't have any real functionality attached to it. So what's going to happen now is we are going to create our handle edit submit. And this is going to need to be async because we're going to be passing the token. So we are going to, because this is form, we're going to need to do e.prevent default. And then we are going to say let new item name equal document.getElementID. Obviously, I haven't created this yet, but I'm just lining it out for us. New item name, that value, then let rec body equal. And so this is again where the documentation might be a little confusing, but it's in the same vein that when we did our post, our rec body, it's a little different than what you may be used to. So the rec body, instead of columns, it's going to be called change set. And the change set's also going to be an array of objects. So instead of name and value, it's going to be column and value. So because we're going to be pointing it at a specific endpoint like delete by ID, we're going to be editing by ID. We don't need to have a column for ID that we're updating because we're already pointing to it. So in our column key name, our value is going to be item name. And then our value is going to be new item name. And then we can go ahead and copy and paste our try catch block. I'll do the post one. So again, because we already have member in create edit form or create the edit modal, we're setting state with edit ID. We can just pull it from there. So if we go into our fetch, we can just say this.state.edit ID. This is going to be a put according to the documents. Update rows is going to be a put. And then just because I've already done this, we're just going to append an await in front of this get items. So that way, when the form is submitted, we're going to wait for the re-render of the items to happen. Then we'll close the edit form. So this close edit modal. So if I save that, we can go ahead and start building our edit modal. If we go into our edit modal, we are going to need a form. This form has a label. This label is going to be edit. There's going to be an input. Type equals text. The ID is going to be new item name as we defined in our code. So new item name, get element by ID. And then we're also going to have a default value because we're going to populate it. And we're going to pass the props down. And I'll show you how we do that. And then we're going to have an input type equals submit. And then outside of the form, we're going to have a button. This button is going to close the edit form, and then we're going to do type equals button on click, and we're going to pass down the edit form or the close edit modal. So let's go ahead and start working on that. So I'm going to go ahead and import. So import edit modal from edit modal, and then I will go into Obviously, there's going to be some errors, but it'll get fixed soon enough. So underneath our edit, we are going to say this.state.is editing. So it's if, not if, but it's true. So and we say this.state.edit ID is equal to the specific item.id we're working with. And we are going to add our edit modal here. And this is where we're going to pass down our props. So we are going to pass down handle edit submit, this.handle edit submit. We are also going to pass down close edit modal, and that's going to be this.close edit modal. And then we are also need to pass down the text to edit, which we store. So when the actually I need to pass in. So before we do that, I forgot to do this. So remember how we said we need two parameters, text to edit and edit ID. So we need to add that into our function. So in our create edit modal function, on the button click, we are going to pass in item.item name and item.id. So that way they can get stored into state. Then we can then pass down. So let's say default text is equal to this.state. Text to edit. And we can go ahead and save that. Still going to break, but that's okay. We're coming back. So if we go back to our edit modal, we're going to have an on submit this.props.handle edit submit. Then in our default value, that's going to be this.props. Default, what did I name it? Default text. And then in our on click, this is going to be this.props. Close edit modal. And that should, now if I hit edit, it only opens up apples, right? If I hit edit, it only opens up, or pairs, it only opens pairs, and it gets pre-populated because we passed it down. So on this click, we're saving this name to state, and then we're passing it down so it appears here. So now, if I edit apples, so it's misspelled, right? So if I type in apples, it gets fixed. And because we said, oh crap. Because we said in the handle edit submit, because we said await this.get items, if I take this out, or actually if I take out the await, the close edit modal will probably happen before. So let's add a test item. So if I edit this, and if I add test here, you see how that's kind of, the timing doesn't work well. So that's why we have the await here. So if I re-edit this, so if I delete this one, and then add a new one, and if I edit it, this is, it's now working, submit. Great. So that's a little bit more fluid, but that's just a little optimization, I guess. But essentially that's it. So we have used DataStax Astra's REST API with authentication. So we have this get Astra token function, which then we use to pass into all of our requests. So our get request, our post request, our put request, and our delete requests. So we've gotten the items, we've displayed them, we've handled adding items, we've handled deleting items, and we've handled editing items. So with this, we'll wrap up the demo. I hope you're able to take something away, and hopefully you can play with the DataStax REST API. Next week, we're actually going to take a look at the GraphQL API. So might do the similar thing. So instead of using React and the REST API, I might be using Gatsby and using GraphQL with DataStax Astra's GraphQL API and building a similar CRUD shopping list app. All right. And then if I go back to the presentation, thank you again for joining us. I hope you're able to take something away. If you want to ally on your Cassandra platform, don't hesitate to reach out. You can contact us at Anant.us, or you can email us at solutions@Anant.us. If you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. And I will open up the floor to questions.
Yeah, I've got a question. So this authentication that you're doing, it's authenticating from your application credentials, right? So if we, let's say I needed to have different shopping carts or different users, I would have to make my own kind of like token system, right? To make sure that like one person can't see the other person's data.
So the authorization actually is based off the database user name and password. So if you have one master credential list, so if you have like a master username and a master password, I'm not sure if Astra allows for sub users per database. If it does, that might be something you have to look into. But if everyone's working with one Astra database, you would only just need a normal one username, one password.
Right. No, I understand that. I'm saying, let's say you do have one username and password, but it's like a multi-user system, so that, you know, let's say I log in and you log in. I don't necessarily want you to see my information. Same database, same Astra database, you know, maybe the same table, but, you know, I want different users to see different data that's stored in the same table. So that's what I was getting at, is that I would have to make my own authentication system to basically to account for that, right? In addition to this authentication layer.
Potentially.
Okay. Right. Cool. I guess another question is, you know, compared to other REST APIs, you know, like either, you know, existing software or things like, you know, like Airtable, you make a table and it has an API. How much more difficult was it to connect to the Astra REST API than it was to, let's say, one of those other, you know, APIs that you've used in the past?
Not super. It's just a little bit wonky. Maybe I was just having a bad day and I couldn't recognize. But again, like I mentioned, so if you're saying get rows, so you see how it has the entire URL here. I would wish that they didn't have this primary key here, because when I first read this, I saw it, because even if you look here, it says primary key is required. So if you wanted to try using this thing and you wanted to get all of your rows like we do in the app, we stop at this part, right? We don't include primary key there. We include primary key if we're doing like a get by ID. I wish that threw me off a little bit. And then once I got used to the request bodies for the post and the puts, it made more sense, because you're working with Cassandra, which, like, if you're used to like relational databases, it's a little bit different. But then once I like practiced it, it started making sense why they had like you're updating specific column names, or if you're inputting, or if when you're adding items, you have specific like name value. So if I had like a potential suggestion, so in their post, so column names, I would no, not queries, add rows. I would potentially change this name to like column, kind of how they have it in the put, because this name kind of throws you off, where it's like name could be anything, but if it was column, you knew specifically what it's about, right? Because like they say name of the column. If they just say column, makes a whole lot more sense. So once you get used to that, I think it's pretty like just normal REST APIs that you're working with. But yeah, it's definitely super useful if you want to potentially bypass like a full stack backend and just directly use this as a front end attachment.
Cool. What? One more question. What you made? You had another presentation that you did where you, well, you worked on the Cassandra.API, right? The Astra-backed Python or Node API. Considering, you know, making that, using it versus using this, if you had to start all over again, you know, the fastest way to get data into a React interface, which one would you start with? Knowing what you know now, both ways.
Just like right away, depending on how complex your data model is in Cassandra, from what I've done so far, like GraphQL might be even a little bit faster because you can like your queries. Again, I still have to look into their Astra's GraphQL API, but from the REST API, if I'm just straight up into a React interface, instead of having to build and connect on the back end, I think this might be faster, right? Because I did this in about what 30 minutes. I built a like a CRUD app. Again, very basic, but depending on the complexity of your data model in Astra, it might be worth just to use their REST API instead of building a whole backend. But depending on if you're doing extra processing that like we did in well, I guess that was actually when working with our put. So if it's just something you need up and going fast, I would recommend the REST API. But if it's something more complex, maybe using the driver might be your better method because you have more customization there. But definitely look at both methods, including the GraphQL method. So into Astra, so they give you the REST API connection, GraphQL, and then the drivers.
Okay, final question. So if you had to expose, let's say you're building an application and it has a web interface, it has a mobile interface, but then you also offer a third-party integration so other people can then connect to that API. Same question. Would you make your own, or would you use this REST API or wrap it and then expose that REST API to third parties?
Let's see if I'm doing this. So like say third party, would I be using like a third party authentication? So like say if I opened up and integrated Google Auth into my front end, I could potentially do that because then your calls are still the same, right? Because then you would just need to integrate that token system with Google Auths. So depending on if you create a new table and then you create a token system, so like we have the shopping list table and then we have a token system table within our same key space or whatever we're working with. It potentially, depending on the complexity, again, it might be easy to do it with the REST API, but if
I would say, like, I think I know where you're going with it. I was asking more like, would you build an application with their built-in REST API and without, well, hopefully not without modification, but would you give the same structure to a third-party developer, like an outside developer to use? You know, how did you feel in terms of the user friendliness of the REST API itself?
User friendliness. So again, like I mentioned, once I played with it a little bit, it was pretty user friendly. So it's just a couple suggestions that I had was, again, like that naming. So this naming could be updated, but in terms of getting it to do what I wanted to do and having someone who's not really worked with it or have a third party work with it, I think they can. And I think it could be passed off, but again, they would just need to read it. And if they have questions, I think it might be some of the things I ran into. So if you do have any of those questions, you can email us at solutions@anant.us or yeah.
Okay. Cool. Thanks.
All right. Let's see, any more questions? Okay, doesn't look like it. We'll go ahead and wrap up. So again, thank you for joining us again here at Anant. And look forward to next week. We're going to take a look at DataStax Astra's GraphQL API. And again, if you want to partner with us on your Cassandra platform, don't hesitate to reach out. You can contact us at anant.us or email us at solutions@anant.us. And if you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe. And we hope to see you soon. Thank you.